Good morning, all. Back, back, back. Is that all right? Dr. McQueen is the producer of this event. Good morning, all. Ever since last week, I've been ruminating on one piece of the presentation. Antietam. Do you remember the numbers of casualty and dead? 8-hour fight, 23,000. North and south, 23,000. Vietnam was 58,000 in 8 years, and that was Vietnamese killing us. The numbers that we killed of them, we don't know. Antietam, Americans on Americans, 23,000. And there had to be an effect. And today, we're going to think through what the effect might have been. Dr. Martinez, we're thrilled always to have you with us.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be back this morning. Great to see all of you. I am having a lot of allergy stuff right now. I don't know if you are as well. I haven't had my booster yet, so it's not that. I need to get it soon. So I'm a little scratchy in my throat. So if I'm getting extra water, that's why. Hopefully that's why. And I will stay away from you as well. We are going to talk about the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam, both today and next week. Today we're going to focus more on the political side of the impact, and then next week we'll talk a little bit more about religion and culture and medical care and funeral practices and all of these other things that are affected when you have in April in Shiloh 6,000 to 8,000 casualties, and then in July or June and July outside Richmond another 8,000 to 10,000 casualties. Oh, thank you. And then in late July in Northern Virginia, another 10,000 casualties. And then in Antietam in September, 23,000 casualties. So the question of what you do with the wounded and dead is a big moral and logistical question that needed to be dealt with over the course of the Civil War. So we'll look more at that next week. This week we're going to focus on the more strictly political side of things, although obviously these questions all intersect in important ways. But that's the plan. I did want to include this image because this question came up last week about Burnside's Bridge. And this is a late 19th century painting that sort of reflects what Union soldiers remembered seeing on the late afternoon assault on the bridge. But if you look at the photographs, both at the time and since, this is very consistent in terms of the arch of the bridge, right? And you can still go there. The bridge is still there. Obviously, it's been repaired and reconstructed over the years, but it's still there, as well as the sort of scale of the embankments, both down the bridge, down to the creek on both sides. So even if the creek was, maybe 3 feet deep, that's still a lot to get through while carrying all of your gear in a wool uniform. But first you have to go down, and then you have to go back up. So it really was. The bridge was challenging enough, but trying to ford Antietam Creek, which is not what we think of when we think of a creek either, right? It's not a little meandering stream of water. It's somewhere between creek and river. And so you get a sense maybe of the challenge, particularly given that there's multiple ridges on the other side of the river for Confederate sharpshooters and later artillery to be placed on, making it that much harder to get across. So what's now known as Burnside's Bridge, right, was a significant obstacle, right, versus the other bridges over Antietam Creek were easier to navigate, the ones that were further north on the battlefield, which is why the Union Army got over those, but struggled with this one. Although, again, the question of if Burnside had been allowed to commit his full force and pull up the corps, the 5th Corps that sat there as in waiting all day long at 10 a.m., would he have made it over? It's an open question, and it's the type of thing we can't ever really answer. But what's important in this story is that Burnside was convinced he would have made it over. And he very loudly blamed McClellan for not giving him the support he needed to make this assault. That'll come up. So I mentioned last week, going back to the politics, that in the summer of 1862, we saw both sides really engage in a more invasive war. Right? Everyone went to war in the summer of 1861 thinking a few months, one big battle, and it'll be over. Right? There's a few people, military strategists, who are saying, I don't think so. Right? But the politicians were convinced this was going to be easy. And when, by the spring of 1862, it's clear that it's not going to be easy, they start making some changes. So back then, you have to sort of think through our current setup of when the legislature is in session. Right? The legislature is basically in session from March through about August every year, and then they go home. Right? So it's maybe more like the state legislature currently, in terms of, well, who knows what Congress is doing currently. But at the time, so a lot of legislation comes rapid fire between March and July, and then it's like, okay, we're done. We're out of here for the year. And so what we see on both sides are very similar processes. I mentioned the Militia Act in the United States in the spring of 1862 that sort of incentivizes the states to, it requires the states to send a certain number of soldiers. Right? It calls up the state militias as well. It provides incentives for soldiers who enlist, both enlistment bounties, but also the chance to select their own unit and form new units. So it doesn't say, there's not a draft yet, but there's sort of an implicit threat behind all of that, that if we don't meet the quota, there will be a draft. Right? And the Militia Act, of course, also very controversially for its time, authorized the enlistment of black men in the militias and in the Union Army. And we see those enlistments pick up in August of 1862 already. The Confederate Conscription Act was a draft, right? A draft of all men at the time between 18 and 45. It eventually gets expanded to 17 to 55. Right? So a year into the war, both sides are struggling to get people. Yes. So a couple things were allowed. One was to hire a substitute. There's also exemptions for a number of things. Most controversially, if you're the owner or overseer on a plantation with at least 20 slaves, you're exempt from the draft. There's an attempt, but there's also exemptions made for, like, if you're the only blacksmith in the county, right? Or the only doctor in the county, or the only teacher in the county, initially at least. There's exemptions for teachers. So there's an attempt to balance the needs of the Army with the needs of the home front. The other thing they do with the Confederate conscription law is detail men. So they'll enlist you, they'll kind of put you through really rudimentary training, and then they'll tell you, okay, your current job for the Army is to go run your farm and grow some wheat because we need to feed everyone, or corn, right? Or whatever it is you grow that's a food stuff. Right? And then if we need you, we'll call you back. Right? But yes, there is a provision in the Confederate Conscription Act to pay a substitute. Right? The United States Conscription Act won't come till a year later. And one of the things they do, instead of paying a substitute, is create what's called a commutation fee, that for $300 you can get out of it, right? Which is a bargain compared to what people were paying for substitutes in the Confederacy. $300 is about an annual wage for a unskilled laborer who probably works in seasonal industries and isn't really working full-time all the time, so it's not cheap, right? But by this, the Confederate substitutes were going for $1,500, $2,000, and then In 1864, the Confederate government's like, okay, well, you hired a substitute, too bad, you're still drafted, right? So they're just, increasingly getting everyone they possibly can by the end of the war. But so part of the answer for why Lee's army went from 60,000 in midsummer 1862 to 40,000 by the end of the summer is, first of all, significant battles, right, in July, but also those draftees who had been mustered in early July have a very high desertion rate. Right? The biggest spikes in desertion rate for each army is right after a group of draftees is brought in. They don't last long. And the Confederate government has spent an awful lot of energy going and finding them and bringing them back. So we also get some fiscal policies that are interesting and important. So in the United States, we have what's known as the Legal Tender Act, creates paper currency, right, which did not exist before in the United States, and specifically says that that is U.S. government money, and the legal tender, and if you look at a dollar bill now, this bill is legal tender for all debts, public and private. It must be accepted as money at the value the government says it has. Right? The Confederate government prints money, but they don't officially make it legal tender, which means people can say, I'm not taking that. Right? And it also, one of the reasons why inflation really spirals out of control in the Confederacy. The other reason is the United States sort of balances that with an income tax, also created a new concept. The Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional on very narrow grounds, that the Constitution says that the compensation of a Supreme Court justice may not be altered or may not be lessened during his tenure, may be increased but may not be lessened. And the income tax lessened his take-home pay and therefore was unconstitutional. That comes from the Chief Justice of the United States, Roger B. Taney, and Lincoln said, thank you very much for your opinion. Goodbye. And the balancing of the income tax getting revenue in, as opposed to just printing paper money with no revenue coming in, is one of the reasons why U.S. inflation rate, it's high. It's 75% over the course of the war. But it's 900% in the Confederacy. Right? And actually the policies they set in motion here are followed again in World War I and World War II to similar effect. So this is seen long term as a fairly good approach to funding a major war. Congress also, what's interesting is that the Republican House of Representatives in the spring of 1862 has some time to do things that aren't specifically about the war, but are about the Republican Party's agenda. So they pass a Homestead Act to make it easier for people to get land in the West, white people at least. They pass the National Railroad Act to create the Transcontinental Railroad. They pass the Land Grant College Act that basically gives each northern state Western land that they can sell to speculators or to railroad companies to fund state universities for teachers and for agriculture and engineering. So that's where we get a lot of like the Big Ten schools and things like that. Congress also took some steps toward emancipation in the summer of 1862, where they had the power to do so. Right? So they eliminated slavery in Washington, D.C. They eliminated slavery in all federal territories, right? Which was the founding principle of the Republican Party. 1856, it was 1854, sorry. It was founded with the one common goal of eliminating slavery in all federal government territories, and 8 years later they've accomplished that, which is pretty impressive. They would not have accomplished that except that all the pro-slavery people had left Congress. Right? The same with most of these laws. Right? They passed some legislation to support compensated emancipation in places like Maryland and West Virginia, Kentucky, those border states, slaveholding places that remained in the Union, are encouraged to enact statewide emancipation with compensation for slaveholders, and federal government is going to provide some financial support for that. They also basically say all fugitive slaves who make it to U.S. territory are free and are under federal protection. Right? So they overturn that clause in the Constitution that says fugitive slaves are not free on the basis of making it to the North. Finally, Congress passed what's known as the Second Confiscation Act. And the Second Confiscation Act says that all property in the hands of a Confederate supporter can be confiscated by the Army for military purposes. Right? So there was an earlier Confiscation Act that was more narrow. Said property actively being used to support the Confederate military cause can be confiscated by the United States military. And summer of 1862, they said, look, anything a Confederate supporter owns is probably going to end up being used in some way to support the Confederacy. Right? So it's all fair game. And because slaves are legally property, this is another step toward emancipation. Right? That any slave owned by a Confederate supporter could technically be emancipated or confiscated, right, by the United States Army and used to its own benefit instead of to Confederate benefit. In reality, this mostly has to do with runaways who make it from Confederate lines to Union lines. The Confiscation Act and also this protection for fugitive slaves resolves a debate that had been going on in the Army about if runaway slaves show up in Union encampments, which they've been doing since May 1861. If the Union Army is in position in a slaveholding state for any amount of time, slaves will run away to them, right? Will show up. And they'll often say, like, I was being forced to work for the Confederate Army. I would rather work for you, right? And I know you say this isn't about emancipation, but you're fighting against my enemy, so I'm going to make you my ally whether you want to or not. And eventually the Union Army says, hey, let's make use of these people. But it causes a lot of conflict because there's not a clear policy about, do you let them stay? Do you let them bring their families? Do you feed everyone? Do you pay people? What do you do? Right? And there's a lot of conflict between individual U.S. Army units who may be this contraband, as they're calling them, contraband of war, right, shows up, and instead of being a camp servant for a Confederate officer, wants to instead be a cook for a Union Army unit, and you're going to pay him, and you're going to tell him he's free, and then somebody from the officer corps comes and says, oh, his owner is looking for him, you have to give him back. Right? And so this caused a lot of conflict within the United States Army, absent a clear policy. And so part of what Congress is doing here in the summer of 1862 is resolving those conflicts in favor of things that erode the institution of slavery, and framing those as things that will help the United States win the war. Slavery supports the Confederacy, not because enslaved people want to support the Confederacy per se, but because they are being used in support of the Confederacy, whether they're digging ditches or serving in camp or driving wagons or tending the wounded or growing the crops, right, that feed the Army. They're being used in support of the Confederacy. And so Union policy over the course of the summer is moving toward, let's find ways to take that support away from Confederate armies. Confederate policy is focused on its own resources and using its own resources to the greatest possible extent. So as we said, there's a lot of clauses in that Conscription Act that are designed to make sure the home front is still functioning enough to feed the soldiers and also feed the people. Because if you have people consistently writing to their husbands and sons and brothers in the Army saying, we're starving, you need to come home, you will have mass desertion. Right? So the home front needs to be reasonably functional for the Army to continue to function. So a lot of the little tiny clauses throughout the Conscription Act, and as it's sort of over and over and over again revised, are designed to balance those needs. As we said, lots of paper money, lots of inflation. The taxes, the most common form of taxes to for the Confederacy are what's known as the tax in kind. right? So in a agricultural economy, people maybe don't have a lot of cash. Instead, you just say, okay, well, I want 10% of your crop, right? So we get a recurring tax in kind on all of the foodstuffs, but also oxen and pigs, which of course are foodstuffs, but not the oxen, but draft animals, things like that can be sort of just taken and used immediately. There's also a policy of impressment, which is if the army is nearby you and they need something, they will take it, right? And they will give you a receipt for it, where you can go to the Treasury that has no money and get a return, except of course you can't because they have no money in the Confederate government, right? Sorry, this is taking longer than I thought. I get all excited about government fiscal policies. So impressment is harder to predict, but if you live in a place where there is frequently an army around you, it's going to happen to you more often than if you live in a place where there's very rarely an army around you. So the impact of impressment really varies. Sequestration is a way of taking the property of people deemed disloyal to the Confederacy. And there's this whole network of informants, and people are encouraged to talk to the local government about the things their neighbors are doing that they think are not sufficiently supportive of the Confederacy, and you can be put in jail and all of your property taken. Right? Both sides have debates over suspensions of the writ of habeas corpus. So questions about can you put someone in jail without direct evidence that they've committed any sort of crime. The Confederate legal system, such as it is, the Supreme Court never really gets off to much of a start in the Confederacy, is a lot more supportive of suspending habeas corpus. It's actually sometimes deemed illegal, sometimes deemed legal on the US side. There's more debate over it. But this question of, like, what do you do with people who are actively discouraging enlistment, for example? What do you do with people who are actively finding ways to support the other side is a recurring one as well, and it comes up in the fall of 1862. So, while all of that was going on in Congress, and Congress is taking these steps to tie emancipation to prosecution of the war, right? Lincoln also proposes an Emancipation Proclamation in the summer of 1862 that goes beyond what Congress just did with the Second Confiscation Act, right? So, Second Confiscation Act said any property belonging to a Confederate supporter can be confiscated. The Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln proposes says any enslaved person who lives in an area of the Confederacy that is still under rebellion, right, that hasn't been retaken by the United States, is free. Right? Regardless of whether or not they can get to Union lines, regardless of whether or not they're being actively used to support the Confederacy, they're free. So it is different, right? It goes deeper. It goes, and it's more. It is still tied to questions of prosecuting the war, right? But at least in the preliminary document, Lincoln also says, the U.S. government will support freed people, right, formerly enslaved people, in taking advantage of this, in finding a way to become free. So he is tying emancipation as a cause to the Union cause. Right? It is still, it's interesting if you look at the preliminary document, is actually talks more about sort of morality and freedom and the rights of people than the final document. The final document is very legalistic with nothing quotable and nothing potentially incendiary. Right? But there are these conversations going on in the fall of 1862 that, while they don't quite make emancipation a cause for the Union Army, they do tie it to the cause, right? So supporting emancipation helps support the Union cause, not just materially, but morally. Right? And if the United States Army wins, emancipation will happen, right? So that's sort of what's going on in the preliminary document, right? So immediate change, So the preliminary document says, as of January 1st, emancipation will happen. Right? So it finally gets presented to the public several days after the Battle of Antietam. Right? So when Lincoln proposed it to his cabinet, it was right after the defeat at Second Manassas or Second Bull Run, and they said, if you do this now, it's going to look desperate. You have to wait until you have a victory. And Antietam was enough of a victory because Lee left Maryland. Right? It was enough of a victory for the Union Army that Lincoln could say, okay, this is what we're going to do next. This is how we're shifting things. So the immediate impact on enslaved people is minimal. There's a sort of, for the response from the Confederacy is Lincoln has only freed slaves in places where he has no power. Right? This is a symbolic gesture that says, enslaved people, you're no longer enslaved, but he has no control over any of these areas because it only applies to areas where the Confederacy is still in charge. Right? That's when the final document comes out in January. It says this only applies to the following places, and it leaves out whole sections. It leaves out any place where the U.S. Army has clear control. Right? Part of the reason for that is what's become very evident with how the confiscation acts are being enforced is that if the U.S. Army is in clear, uncontested control of a place in the South, slavery is over in that place. Right? Enslaved people run away. They stand up for themselves. There are letters from the western parts of Virginia saying, we know the Union Army is 20 miles away. So do our slaves. Slavery has become a voluntary state at this point. If they're staying here, they are demanding things. We have to make concessions to keep them here, because if we tell them no, tomorrow we'll get up and they'll all be gone. Right? So there is this widespread sense that once we have these U.S. policies for confiscation, for contrabands, for emancipation, that slavery becomes harder and harder to maintain in its pre-war state if you are anywhere close to a long-term Union Army installation. Right? Yes?
Argue that the Emancipation Proclamation hardened resistance in the South?
Absolutely. Particularly the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, because the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation says we will support enslaved people in whatever they do to exercise their new freedom. So white Southerners look at this and say, he is recommending an insurrection. He wants slaves to kill us in our beds at night, right? And the U.S. government is going to support that. And actually, there's Europeans looking at it going, this is going to cause a mess. This is going to be chaos. And this is actually the point where there's the greatest chance of European invasion, because what they see is like Haiti happening all over the U.S. South, right? And a massive slave insurrection, right? So when the final document comes out and it doesn't have any of that language, instead the response from white Southerners was, well, this is charming and really, really funny. And there's a lot of news articles in early 1863, right after the final Emancipation Proclamation, talking about how high the prices are for slave sales at that moment. Right? That people are buying and selling slaves at an even greater rate and paying even more for them than they had before, partly because of the massive inflation, right? But also this sense that we are determined to show that we believe slavery will continue to exist, regardless of what Lincoln says, because he can't enforce this proclamation of his. The other thing that happens with the preliminary emancipation is a much stronger statement in favor of black enlistment. So the Militia Act had said, it's allowed. Lincoln puts out a statement with the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862, encouraging it and asking the Army to explicitly set up black regiments. And that's another thing that white Southerners do not respond to well. Right? And their response is a pronouncement that essentially any black Union soldier is going to be treated as a slave engaged in an insurrection. Any officer of a black regiment, and the officers were all white, is going to be treated as having incited a slave insurrection. Black soldiers captured will either be put to death or returned to slavery. White officers of black units will also be put to death. Right? And the response from the Lincoln administration is, well, if you do that, I'm going to start executing your prisoners. Right? And so there's a clear sort of sense on the side of white Southerners that this is horrific. Right? And we will now do whatever it takes to fight back against the United States and to prevent being forced to live in a country with people who will do something like this. Right? So it does absolutely harden Confederate resistance, either in a way that they're sort of laughing about its lack of effectiveness, right? Or talking about how terrified they are of a president who would do such a thing. Right? So there's very little immediate change in terms of how slavery works. Right? There's certainly immediate change in terms of the Army, because now there's, over the course of the next 2 years, 180,000 black men are going to enlist in the Union forces. Again, there is this symbolic sense that emancipation is now part of the conversation in a way that can't be removed from it. And that if the Union wins, slavery is going to come to an end in some way. Right? Not clear how yet. So the question of foreign intervention is a complicated one, and I could bring in an expert on that because there's a lot I don't know. But what's interesting is that right after the preliminary proclamation is we have European powers saying, we might need to intervene because Lincoln is setting up some sort of massive slave war. Right? He's setting up enslaved people and saying he's going to support them if they rebel against their masters and cut their throats in the night. And maybe we do need to step in. And so when a couple months later Lincoln comes out with the final proclamation that is just like a list of places that are free and not free and very legalistic and unquotable language, nothing soaring rhetoric in the Emancipation Proclamation, England and France are like, okay, we don't need to intervene, you're fine. You're not setting up some sort of massive race war. It's going to be okay. We'll stay out of it. Right? And part of why is that Lincoln, there's a lot of diplomatic back and forth. There's the question of the blockade. Confederates want the British to intervene with their navy and take out the Union blockade. And they absolutely could have. Right? Early on, the Union blockade was not very effective, and international law says a blockade is legal as long as it's effective. If you can't maintain your blockade, it's illegal. And people have the right to just do whatever they want. The British were worried about being held to such a high standard themselves at all times, so they didn't want to intervene and then have, even though they had the most powerful navy in the world and would have been hard to stand up against, they also didn't really want to put this like, a blockade must be perfect or everyone can attack it, right? That was too high a standard for them to want to have to be held to on their own. There's an interesting debate within the British government about whether to intervene. There's a couple issues here. One is they overpurchased cotton in 1860. So they don't actually need anything from the Confederacy for the first year and a half of the war. And by the time they're running low on cotton, they have taken enough control of the Sinai Peninsula that they can get some from Egypt, which it turns out is better than American cotton. So we're good, we're covered. There's also, there's a strong anti-slavery wing in the British Parliament. There's also a strong, emancipation didn't work all that well in Jamaica. It was kind of an economic disaster. And what will happen to the worldwide economy if the United States moves toward emancipation? So there's not a clear consensus among the British leaders or the British people. Right? There's a middle-class British population that's anti-slavery. There's a working-class British population that depends on factory jobs that require cotton. So there's a lot of debate early on about, can we financially afford to not support the Confederacy, and the British working class is fine with supporting the Confederacy. Right? So it's only when they realize they don't need American cotton to keep the factories going that there's like, what's the upside? There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of money that would be involved in supporting the Confederacy. It's not clear we get anything from that. Right? So it is true, right, that Antietam is one of the things that sort of tips British and French interest away from supporting the Confederacy, because they're seeing this momentum of Robert E. Lee's army prior to Antietam, and it's looking like if Robert E. Lee's army can do this and be successful in U.S. territory, then it's clear they're going to win. And obviously everyone wants to back the winner. Right? So when it's less clear that they can win, or less obvious, everyone takes a step away. But there's a whole bunch of other things going on in there at roughly the same time. Right. There is very briefly a transatlantic telegraph line. They get about 3 messages across it, and then they're out of luck. So it's several months, right, to get information across the Atlantic, and that's part of the problem, right, is you don't quite know what's going on. Lincoln is very frustrated that the European papers only talk about the Eastern Theater, where the Confederate Army is doing really well. And all of those victories that the Union Army had in the Mississippi Theater, in the Mississippi River, in Tennessee, don't show up in the European press because they don't go there. Like, that's just too far away. It's like way out in the woods. We don't care. They stay on the Eastern Seaboard. They basically stay in Washington, D.C., and just get the local information and go with that. And so, the Europeans aren't getting the full picture of what's going on in the war. Did you have a follow-up?
I wanted to ask you, I have read contradictory things about the effect of Mason and Slidell on their colleagues as effective ambassadors in the South.
I haven't read a whole lot about them, so I'm not really prepared to answer. I think, on the whole, they were well received in Europe. There was obviously a lot of early on diplomatic wrangling over whether or not they would be allowed to go and what would happen to them. But I honestly don't know enough to be able to answer a question about them. So I'll see what I can find out. Maybe find you a book to read.
Didn't Britain abolish slavery in the 1820s, which made them kind of...
It did. So yes, the British government abolished slavery in the British Empire right around 1830. And as I've said, Jamaica's sugar production plummeted. And so a lot of people in Britain saw, like, well, that was a bad idea. Let's not do that again. It's a lot easier to abolish slavery in your empire when it's not really visible in the capital on a regular basis, right? The people living in England didn't have to see free, formerly enslaved people walking around on a daily basis, the way people in the United States would have had to. Right? So yeah, there is a question of, is it hypocritical for them to support a slaveholding government? But they keep buying their cotton from the American South for 3 decades after abolishing slavery. So they continue to support slavery. Right? They continue buying extra sugar from the Spanish colonies that have slavery until the 1890s. So there's not a clear anti-slavery position in Great Britain. So, thinking about the meaning of the battle, what's interesting is that both sides claim this as a victory. The Union claims it as a victory because Robert E. Lee was forced out of Maryland. The Confederate side claims it as a victory because they held their ground for 2 days and left on their own terms and kept their army intact. And Lee accomplished a lot of his goals in terms of affecting public opinion, right, and getting his army to live off the land in the North for 3 weeks, right, and give the farmers in Virginia a little bit of a break. Right? So, it's interesting because sub out General McClellan, and this could have been said by somebody on the Union side, what Charles Colcock Jones says, right? We held the honors of the field, but the long list of killed and wounded attests to the severity of the struggle. It was a victory, but an extremely costly one. What's very clear in the aftermath is that neither side's soldiers are significantly demoralized, even though the scale of the loss is horrific. What they see is, hey, we are capable of winning battles. Right? And for the Army of the Potomac, there's a general sense among the rank and file soldiers that they are capable of winning battles, and the problem is their leadership. Right? And if they were left alone to do what they do best, they would be successful. Right? And among the Confederate rank and file, there is the sense that Robert E. Lee is an impressive general, and we weren't decimated by what we just did. Again, we held the field, we held them off, we left on our own terms, and we will continue to be successful. And there's no reason to think we won't be. So while everyone is absolutely looking around and saying, this is a horrific sense of casualties and the dead and the wounded and what are we going to do, there's also a sense that we're going to keep fighting. And part of it becomes this self-perpetuating cycle for soldiers on both sides, that the death of their comrades in service of the cause needs to be honored by continuing to fight for the cause. Right? And so the only way you can honor the dead is by accomplishing the thing they were trying to accomplish. And so we're going to keep fighting in their memory. Right? And so that we see that sort of affecting morale. Right? And that we're fine, and if we could just get our leaders to do their job, we would be successful, particularly for the Army of the Potomac. Civilians are a little more mixed. Right? When these lists of dead and wounded start coming home in the papers, when people start going into Maryland to collect the bodies of their sons and brothers and husbands, and bringing back, again, if you think of one of the divisions, one of the brigades in the 2nd Division having 50% casualties, and those units being very locally formed. Right? We have towns where half of the young men are gone. Right? And so the impact of that on Northern voters is that they're absolutely grateful that their army did its job. And they support their army, but they are furious at the Lincoln administration. Right? And they cannot allow the war to continue as it has been without some statement of their frustration. Confederates are less frustrated by this. And I don't entirely know why. I think maybe their frustration is less obvious because there was not an election in the fall of 1862 in the Confederacy. Right? So by the time they get around to having another election, there's been so many other massive battles in the intervening time that this is not the one that they're talking about. Right? But there's an election in the fall of 1862. It's congressional elections, it's a third of the Senate, and it's a lot of governors. Right? And elections are different. Right? There's not one election day. Right? Before I came to North Carolina, I did not know about early voting. Early voting is great. But so the election process takes months, depending on where you are. People vote at different times, so that the returns can all sort of be arriving at Washington at roughly the same time. So if you're farther away, your election takes place sooner. So the voting is already underway in some places in the immediate aftermath of this battle. Right? And as the news is trickling in, right, it's going to be affecting how people vote. Right? And who they hold responsible, obviously, they hold the president responsible. What's interesting is that hardcore Republicans say the problem is McClellan. McClellan is a Democrat, and McClellan has very clearly, very vocally opposed to emancipation and fights back against the Lincoln administration, and he's the problem. Democrats say Lincoln is the problem, right? We get a very clear partisan understanding of which leader is to blame at this moment. Yeah, you can't imagine a partisan response to a war at this point. Okay. So, Democrats capitalize on the devastating death tolls and the fact that most Northerners are not really convinced that emancipation is a good idea, right? Response to the Emancipation Proclamation among Democrats, very opposed. Most Republicans are kind of like, I'm not convinced. You're going to have to sell me on the fact that this is necessary. So there's a lot of people who are just in the middle who are like, I don't want black people living near me. Right? So prove to me that this isn't going to change my life in any way, and I might be on board with it. Right? Republicans try to capitalize on try to set themselves up as the patriotic ones by holding enlistment rallies that are also campaign events. Right? So sign up, come here, you're a local Republican elected official, and then go sign up for the Army. Right? These things are tied in the way they present themselves to the public. And there's a few important Democrats, particularly in the Midwest, also in parts of New York and Pennsylvania, that are actively disrupting those rallies and discouraging people from enlisting. Right? And so again, we see the question of habeas corpus because some of those men, including Democrats running for office who are going around and telling people don't enlist, right? The Lincoln administration and his allies in various governors' offices has them put in jail. And so one is a guy named Clement Vallandigham, who's running for the office of governor of Indiana. And Lincoln and the sitting Republican governor, Oliver Morton, have Vallandigham put in jail. He's put in jail a couple times. At one point, he goes to the Confederacy. He causes trouble there. They put him in jail, too. Vallandigham shows up again as the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket in 1864, running for vice president from jail, where he's been placed, again, for disrupting enlistment proceedings. There's all kinds of precedent, yes. So, the other thing that they do is allow soldiers to vote in the field. This is a new idea, the absentee ballot. Some people are sent home, right? So some units are given leave and sent home so they can vote if their state government is not willing to try this. But other states are like, sure, let's give that a shot. We want to reinforce the idea that these are citizen soldiers. They are not going to stay in the Army forever. They are still members of their communities. They are still interested in their communities. We're constantly sending them newspapers and information that is widely read in camp. And everyone is aware of what's going on, and they should have the right to vote. Right? But again, you have to think about elections in the 1860s. There is no secret ballot. Right? You go to your local courthouse, your local tavern, wherever it is, your local schoolhouse, wherever it is they're holding the election, or wherever it is they're holding, wherever's the polling place in your community, and there's a clerk there with a book writing down who each person voted for. And he says it out loud to confirm that that's who you want to vote for. And everyone else in town is hanging around watching this, particularly if it's at the tavern, having a good time. Right? And the same thing happens in camp. Voting is a big day. Everyone 21 and over, because that's the voting age at the time, gets to come up and vote and have their vote recorded and get an extra whiskey ration or some extra coffee, depending on their preference, because some men are in the temperance movement at this point. And everyone knows who everyone voted for. And it's interesting, because this is a risk on the part of the Lincoln administration. How exactly do the soldiers feel about the way they have been conducting the war? And the military vote is generally leaning Republican in the fall of 1862. Despite how beloved McClellan is, and his, in the Army of the Potomac at least, and his very obvious dislike of Lincoln, his soldiers seem to be in favor of what the Lincoln administration is doing. Seem to be in favor of continuing the war. Seem to be in favor of emancipation because they've seen in Virginia what it can do to help them. And in the Midwest, where and in the Western armies that are mostly drawn from the Midwest, they haven't seen quite as obvious a statement in favor or evidence in favor of emancipation, but they've been successful. Right? Their armies are getting the job done, so they have no reason to think there's a problem. Right? So the soldier vote, such as we know, we have much better data in 1864 because they did this much more widely. The soldier vote goes in favor of the Republicans slightly. What we don't know is how much coercion, either overt or implicit, is involved in getting that to happen. Right? If everyone in your unit is voting a certain way and it's public, right, that might shape how you make your voice heard. Right? What we know for sure is that this was a bad election for the Republicans as far as the House of Representatives was concerned. They lost their majority. They go from a really solid majority to a slim minority, right? 4% is not a huge Democratic edge, particularly if you think of the size of the House being much smaller at the time. What's important is that Republican governors in the Midwest in particular stayed in office. So we're seeing these split votes, right, where states are keeping the Republican governor but maybe replacing the Republican senator with a Democrat, or a district is replacing its representative with a Democrat, but still enough of them are voting for the Republican governor to keep him in place. And not just in Indiana, where the guy running against the governor is in jail, but throughout the Midwest. So it's a mixed result. Right? It's certainly a result that shows that people are unhappy with the conduct of the war, but maybe not willing to throw it out entirely. Right? They're not voting for these guys who say stop enlisting. They're voting for the guys who say emancipation was a bad idea. And that's important, right? If we look at the individual returns, right, emancipation was probably the biggest thing that took down Republicans in this election. The guys who were out there actively discouraging enlistment and disrupting enlistment, railing against the draft, are not winning to the same extent that the people who are focused on emancipation and race won. So that's an important signal. What's also interesting is that even though the Democrats did take control of the House of Representatives when they returned in the spring of 1863, they didn't undo any of the Republicans' legislation. So there's a sense that even though that stuff is controversial, it's not unpopular enough to throw it out. And part of that is that by the time we get to March 1863, and Congress is actually, that Congress elected in the fall of 62 is actually in office, right? Circumstances have progressed to the point where some of it can't be undone, right? And some of it actually starts to look like a good idea once you're there and seeing the impact and looking at the fine print, as opposed to just being motivated by people shouting at you. I'm running short on time, so I want to see what I have next here. Oh, okay, we got to talk about this, right? George B. McClellan, right, kept his army encamped on the Antietam battlefield for 2 months after the battle, almost 2 months. On October 4th, Lincoln went to visit him very famously. They had this meeting in McClellan's tent. They took lots of formal pictures. In all of his public statements, Lincoln was very congratulatory. In the tent alone, Lincoln was telling him, for the love of God, do something. Right? Move your army. Let's make a plan. Right? And he and McClellan work out a plan to take the Union Army back on the offensive, to head into Virginia, and not just let Robert E. Lee fortify his positions and prepare for the assault. Let's go. Let's move before it gets any worse. Lincoln went back to Washington, it was very close by, in the evening of October 4th, thinking that McClellan was going to move his army. And 3 weeks later, McClellan's army was still sitting in Antietam, in camp. And Lincoln sends him a telegram. When are you going to move your army? McClellan responded, well, my horses are tired. And this is where Lincoln very famously asks him, again, 6 weeks after the battle, will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that would fatigue anything? He just sits there. But Lincoln can't do anything about it. He's getting pelted on all sides from the Republicans in Congress, from the Corps commanders who are absolutely furious that they're just wasting the fall, doing nothing. And Lincoln says, I can't replace McClellan. First of all, I don't know who I would replace him with. That's a problem. Second of all, he's really popular with the soldiers. He's really popular with Democratic voters. And if I fire him now, I will have an electoral problem on my hands. So, when it's clear that the election is over, Lincoln fires McClellan. The consequences have already happened, and he's got 2 years to fix it when it comes to the electoral side of things. He replaces McClellan with Ambrose Burnside, McClellan's most vocal critic in the Army of the Potomac. Burnside had been calling for more active prosecution of the war, both in terms of how people fought, but also all of these policies that the Republican Party had put in place. The best little Burnside anecdote is he didn't like having a tent. He didn't like being in the back. He wanted to be in the front, which, good for a Corps commander, maybe not for the person who's in charge of the whole army. Right? So Burnside famously said that his headquarters were in the saddle, and somebody said his headquarters are where his hindquarters should be. Burnside convinced that he was going to save the Union cause. He did not, as it turns out. And was not, of course, the last we hear of McClellan, because in 1864, George B. McClellan is the Democratic Party's candidate for president. So we have McClellan, the not particularly successful general, but well-loved, and the guy in prison for discouraging enlistment, and that's who the Democratic Party runs in 1864 and almost wins. Right? Lincoln won re-election because the soldiers, by the fall of 1864, felt that he was prosecuting the war appropriately and was going to was going to lead them to victory. The soldier vote in those absentee balloting, right, put Lincoln over the edge. If it had just been the civilians, Lincoln would not have won re-election. So that's, again, kind of what's going on politically with Antietam and its aftermath. And I think, again, the most interesting thing is that the soldiers on both sides were simultaneously devastated by the loss of life and also convinced that the way to fix this was to fight harder. Right? That we can't hold back. The only way to victory is to fully engage, even if that means continued horrific loss of life. And so what we will see, and again, we know that this is the bloodiest day of the war. They didn't know that. Right? It was not clear. There's a lot more bloodshed to come, unfortunately. And so, yeah, they're not sure if it's going to get better or worse, but there is a sense amongst the rank and file men in the Army that they need to keep fighting, and they need a leader who's going to let them keep fighting. And that's where we'll stop for today. Any last questions? I know we've hit our hour. I don't want to hold you. Thank you so much.
What a pleasure. What an absolute pleasure just to be washed anew. Two things. Dr. Martinez brought with her a whole series of history books that are now sitting in our library. A former professor at Pembroke has gone to his great reward and left all of these books behind, and we are getting parts and pieces of his library. So walk in there. If something engages you, put it under your arm and take it away. Next week we're going to deal with very human things, aren't we? Yeah. So what I need is a volunteer. Since we're going to deal with medical issues, we're going to deal with an amputation. So I need a volunteer. Bite on a stick, and we're going to bring a saw, because that's the way it was done. It is the war that never ended, at least for us. It is a mark on America that just keeps coming back, and we're deeply, deeply indebted to you, my friend.
I actually have two announcements. One, if you're not sick of history already today, 4 o'clock today at UNCP in the library, there's a program on the Kennedy assassination, right? So its impact at the time, its impact in the 60 years since. So if you're free this afternoon and you want to make the trip over there, it's with 3 faculty members, 2 from history, including Ryan Anderson, who I think you heard from over the summer. And then on November 8th, the library is having a program on Robeson County during World War II and sharing some of its resources on local soldiers, the local home front that they have available now on their website. So there's 2 programs going on campus if you are in a position to make your way over there.
Friends, go in peace. Thank you, Madeira.
Thank you.
I have another source for you. If you have lots and lots of books you can't get rid of, try the veterans groups.
Okay,
Because my sister-in-law just redid her house and gave away hundreds of books,
got it.
and the veterans came and picked them all up.
Okay.
Are you well enough for lunch or not?
I think so. It doesn't bother you.
I'm going to leave you early because I have a doctor's appointment.
Okay.
So let me take that.
Oh, I was gonna stick that in.
At the front